This is a Retrofit Information Support and Expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. My name's Connor Kelly. I'm a junior consultant here at Turner & Townsend, and I'll be leading this session or hosting this session today. You'll notice that your cameras and microphones have been muted for the duration of the presentation, but there will be plenty of opportunity for question and discussions towards the end of the presentation, and we should finish on time around 4 o'clock. Please use the chat function as we go if you have any questions, and we can ensure that our presenters touch on that later on. Perfect. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Lucy and Sunny, who will be leading the presentation today on Awaabs law for the retrofit supply chain. So over to you, Lucy and Sunny.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I weighed in very briefly in terms of an introduction to Baillie Garner, myself, Baillie Garner. Lucy will, of course, provide an introduction, but just a little bit around our journey in respect of damp and mould. So I'm Sunny Cook. I'm a chartered building surveyor by trade, and I'm one of the partners in the organisation and one of the working group members responsible for co-authoring our damp and mould toolkit. Lucy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on Awaabs law for the retrofit supply chain. We have got a really full agenda to get through this afternoon, and we'll be covering an intro to Baillie Garner, background to Awaabs law, what is proposed and when, Awaabs law process flow, HHSRS within Awaabs law, when the Act applies, hazard notification types and examples, implications for retrofit, common issues, and then further upcoming events and resources to look out for. So a bit about us. So I'm Lucy Molyneux from Baillie Garner. I'm an associate partner and chartered building surveyor by profession. I lead one of the building surveying teams here from our Birmingham office and also the retrofit offering across the Midlands.
Yes, hello, and as I mentioned, Sunny Cook, I'm chartered building surveyor, one of the working group members responsible for co-authoring our damp and mould toolkit.
Thanks, Sunny. Okay, so a bit about Baillie Garner. We are a purpose-driven multidisciplinary consultancy delivering a vast array of services across multiple sectors. We have 270 employees spread across 3 offices in Birmingham, South London and Manchester, and we will reach our 50-year anniversary next year. We've been working in the retrofit arena since 2008 on a variety of schemes, and we're also proud to be a B Corp, putting the environment and communities we work in at the forefront of decision making. We're absolutely delighted to share our expertise through not only these Masterclass sessions, but also through a series of our own published toolkits, all of which are free to access via our website and include topics such as retrofit at scale and damp and mould, to name a couple, both highly relevant to this afternoon's topic, should you wish to do some further reading. Starting with the background to Awaabs law. Who was Awaabs? Awaabs was a 2-year-old child living with his parents in Rochdale who tragically died from a cardiac arrest in December 2020 as a result of a respiratory condition caused by extensive mould growth in the flat he lived in. This tragedy triggered a response from the Ministry of Housing and highlighted the urgent need for housing reform. Following a petition led by Awaabs' parents, the landmark Social Housing Regulation Act received royal assent in July 2023 and aimed to improve social housing by increasing landlord accountability, including the introduction of strict time limits to address hazards under Section 42 of the Act, which forms Awaabs law. In January 2024, the Conservative government then launched a public consultation on Awaabs law, with an initial focus on establishing clear timeframes for social landlords to investigate and repair hazards, including damp and mould. The outcome of the consultation response was unfortunately not publicly released, and some time then elapsed before we heard what would happen next. In February 2025, a press release was issued which confirmed all emergency hazard repairs must be completed within 24 hours and that we would hear more later in the year, which we did. In June 2025, the Ministry of Housing published a formal draft guidance on Awaabs law, stating a finalised guidance would also be published in readiness before it formally comes into force on the 27th of October this year, entitled The Hazards in Social Housing Regulations 2025. We still await the finalised version of the guidance. What is proposed and when? Well, as I've mentioned, Awaabs law will come into force on the 27th of October this year and is being released in a phased approach. From the 27th of October, social landlords will have to address all emergency hazards and all damp and mould hazards that present a significant risk of harm to tenants within the proposed fixed timescales. In 2026, they will then extend the regulation to include further HHSRS hazards where they present a significant risk of harm, which we'll look at shortly. And lastly, in 2027, they will extend the regulation again to all remaining HHSRS hazards where they present a significant risk of harm. The reason for the phased approach is cited in the guidance to test and learn, with the anticipation amendments will be introduced as necessary. On screen is diagram 1 taken from the guidance document on the Gov.uk website, which lays out the process flow for determining the timescales. There are 3 routes on the flow chart following the landlord becoming aware of a hazard, either because it's been reported or the landlord becomes aware by other means, which we will cover later. Through triaging, the landlord needs to determine, is it out of scope, a potential significant hazard, or a potential emergency hazard. This triaging stage is significantly important as it sets the timescale the landlord then has to deal with the hazard. If it's a potential significant hazard, the landlord has 10 working days to investigate, 3 working days within the investigation concluding to provide a written summary of the investigation and conclusion, 5 working days within the investigation concluding to make the property safe and begin initial work, and a further 12 weeks to commence any further work or intrusive surveys as needed. If unable to make the property safe within the timeframes, the landlord must provide alternative accommodation until the significant hazard is resolved. On the other hand, if it's a potential emergency hazard, the landlord has 24 hours to investigate and make safe. Again, if unable to resolve, but this time within 24 hours, then alternative accommodation must be provided until the emergency hazard is resolved. And similarly to the significant hazard route, again, you will then have 3 working days within the investigation concluding to provide a written summary of the investigation and conclusion. HHSRS features within Awaabs law. For those who may not know, the HHSRS stands for the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which is a risk-based evaluation tool used to assess hazards. Awaabs law applies to the types of hazards prescribed by the HHSRS, but it is important to note it does not require a full HHSRS assessment to be carried out. Instead, Awaabs law uses a person-centred approach. The assessment should consider the tenant's circumstances when assessing the risks presented by a hazard. Awaabs law, therefore, does not require a hazard to be a Category 1 level hazard under the HHSRS system in order to be in scope of Awaabs law, as there may be instances where a particular tenant is at greater risk from hazardous conditions. For example, a tenant with age or health related vulnerabilities may be at significant risk from a home affected by damp and mould, even if you were to score that as a Category 2 hazard under the HHSRS system. As I referenced earlier, Awaabs law is being released in a phased approach with only emergency hazards and damp and mould hazards from October 2025. 2026 will see the regulation extended to include excess cold and heat, falls, structural collapse, fire and electrical, and domestic and personal hygiene, with any remaining hazards being introduced in 2027, except overcrowding. When does the Act apply? For a hazard to be in scope, it must A. be part of buildings or land for which the social landlord is responsible, B. be in the landlord's control to fix, C. not be damage that is a result of breach of contract by the tenant, D. result from a deficiency, defects, disrepair, or lack of maintenance, and E. be a significant or emergency hazard. These are taken directly from the guidance, should you wish to refer back to them, which are available on the government website. Just reflecting on item C, not be damage that is a result of breach of contract by the tenant. The guidance specifically references causing deliberate damage to the property and using fixtures and fittings inappropriately, and provides the example blocking of ventilation fans. With this in mind, we could end up in situations where landlords refuse to act on account of an observation like this. Given that a blocked up ventilation fan could cause condensation-related mould growth, would suggest that this not be ignored. Whilst I agree it wouldn't be in scope of Awaabs law, taking a holistic approach would recommend prompt action to address such instances. Of course, happy to take any further comments or thoughts on this at the end. Item D on the slide before included the term deficiency, and the guide goes on to define what deficiency means under the Act. Deficiency covers defects such as a lack of thermal insulation in the structure of the home that leads to excessive mould growth, disrepair such as a broken window or door that could lead to excess cold, and a lack of maintenance such as a deteriorating damp-proof course. Let's explore that as an example. A solid wall Victorian property, as originally constructed, has no insulation to the walls. For mould growth to occur, there would need to be sufficient relative humidity levels combined with a surface temperature where the dew point is reached for condensation to establish on internal wall surfaces of said external walls. The lack of insulation alone does not necessarily cause mould growth. So how could mould growth be proven to be caused by the lack of thermal insulation alone, where it might actually be because the ventilation fan is blocked up, which on the previous example I've just shared would take it out of scope? I think this needs further exploration on release of the finalised guidance. The third example on screen is also slightly ambiguous, and perhaps the finished guidance will expand on this further with some more commonly found examples. After all, how does one reasonably maintain a material that is fully embedded within the structure of a building? From the two examples I've shared, it's clear that there are still some aspects which we will all have questions on, and I would encourage everyone to utilise the feedback and clarification mechanism provided on the government website to help shape any future amendments made, because as I've referenced, the government want to trial this and want to take on board feedback which may be introduced through the phased approach. How are hazards notified? I mentioned earlier this could be a notification from the tenant via various forms of communication with the landlord or by other means. And it's the other means that I would be very cautious about as a landlord. Landlords' legal obligation under Awaabs law is when they become aware of the hazard, which is day 0. Becoming aware is prescribed in the Act as discovering a potential hazard during a routine inspection or visit, carrying out an investigation into a different or related hazard under Awaabs law, being notified by a third party, including contractors, being notified by a regulator or other body, or a tenant raising an issue affecting their home, or someone raising an issue on the behalf of the tenant. Anyone commissioned by the landlord to enter the property, whether that be domestic energy assessors, retrofit assessors, or installers, have a duty to report potential hazards to the landlord if they become aware of them during their visit. What are the type of hazards? I referenced earlier when we looked at the flowchart, there are 2 types, significant and emergency. Significant is defined as a risk of harm to the occupier's health or safety that a reasonable lessor with the relevant knowledge would take steps to make safe as a matter of urgency. Emergency is defined as imminent and significant risk of harm and a risk of harm to the occupier's health or safety that a reasonable social landlord with the relevant knowledge would take steps to make safe within 24 hours. Now, interestingly, the guidance provides examples of emergency hazards, which are listed out there, but not for significant hazards. I'm rather hoping that we'll have some examples provided in the finalised guidance on suggestions for what the significant hazards might be. But meanwhile, we have attempted to categorise some real case studies ourselves, which we will come on to shortly. The key difference to note is the health distinction. A significant hazard references a risk of harm to the occupier's health or safety, whereas the emergency hazard references an imminent and significant risk of harm. Both sound pretty serious, but there is more weighting on the emergency hazard. On the next 2 slides, I have some examples, and I think before I move on to those, it's worth mentioning these are focusing on the damp and mould related hazards that could be either significant or emergency hazards, given that that's what's coming out on the 27th of October, along with the other emergency hazards. I think at this point, if we could have some engagement in the chat function. So we're going to release 2 votes. You can either vote for emergency or significant hazards. Sunny, could you give me a signal when that's ready to go?
Yeah.
And while we do that, I will start with explaining the example. So for the first example, which is a photo on the left of the screen, we have a textbook mould pattern to the scaling. This was a damp mould condensation inspection of the property following historic loft top-up works carried out, and this is a child's bedroom. On triaging, you've determined it is in scope of Awaabs law, but is it emergency or significant?
So Lucy, I don't have the ability to raise one, but I think if we encourage individuals to either put in the chat whether it's emergency or significant, and I'll capture the results for each.
What I'll do is I'll put like this message for emergency and then like this message for significant.
Brilliant.
Perfect. Have we got some votes flooding in?
we've
We're
got
starting to
3
come
for
in.
emergency and then like this message for significant. So both messages are in the group. If you could like which one you think applies.
Very overwhelmingly emergency at the moment, Lucy.
Okay, fantastic. Well, wouldn't be wrong if you voted emergency. It is indeed an emergency hazard. And that's due to the age-related vulnerability of the occupier, it being a bedroom, and just the expanse of mold growth present. And this is unfortunately something that we see far too often and is an example of missed opportunities at design, PIBI and installation stage. It's worth noting that this particular example was not carried out following the PAS standard and was just an isolated loft top-up. And I think that really demonstrates the value that following the PAS standard can have to avoid circumstances such as these. Okay, then for the next example on the right, we have isolated peeling wallpaper as a result of some low-level dampness on the ground floor of a property occupied by 2 adults, neither of whom have any health conditions currently. On triaging, you've determined it is in scope of Awaabs law, but is it emergency or is it significant?
Seeing lots of significant this time around, Lucy. 1 emergency.
Okay, I think we're getting the hang of it. Now, I would caveat that this is our view on this in the absence of any provided examples in the guidance. But our view is that it is a significant hazard. There is no mold growth. The area of dampness is isolated to the ground floor and the occupiers have no current health or age-related vulnerabilities. However, as health could be impacted by ongoing dampness, this is why it would fall in scope. Okay, next one. This is an interesting one, and this case study actually relates to both photos on screen. The tenant at this property reported some mold growth and significant condensation issues, citing that the heating system wasn't providing adequate heat. On arrival, the boiler was off, fan spurs were off, and internal temperatures were 12.1 degrees, with relative humidity of 70.7% as shown on the photo of the hygrometer. Now, referencing back to determining when hazards are in scope, as a reminder, it must be in the landlord's control to fix and not to be damaged that as a result of breach of contract by the tenant. This property was not being heated. The fan spurs were off. There was mold growth proven to be caused by condensation generated within the property, not condensation generating defects. The heating system was fully checked, was suitably sized and in working order, with insulation levels in the property adequate to retain the heat. Would this be in scope of Awaabs law? For this, if we have a simple yes or no.
Not in scope from Loretta. Yeah, out. No, no. I think we're unanimous on that one, Lucy.
Fantastic. Not in scope. Now, clearly there's something else at play here, and we had serious welfare concerns for this tenant who was facing fuel poverty, and we reported this to the tenant liaison officer on the same day to see what support might be appropriate. The World Health Organization recommends internal ambient temperatures of between 18 to 24 degrees to prevent health conditions associated with long exposure to cold temperatures. The Awaabs law guidance document then goes on to detail the process for investigations, the written summary itself, making safe works and beginning further repair works. But perhaps that could be covered in another session, because I'm going to move on now to the implications for retrofit. Well, what are the implications for retrofit? The nature of retrofit results with homes becoming more airtight and better insulated. However, these interventions can cause increased levels of dampness in the building fabric and ambient air. We often come across homes that have had inappropriate repair works carried out that result in them not being retrofit ready. For instance, installing an injected damp-proof course when the issue was that the original damp-proof course is bridged, or incorrect pointing repairs as shown in the image on screen. I'm sure we've all come across examples of where retrofit has not had the desired outcomes. Baillie Garner certainly have, whether that be in a retrofit technical capacity, auditing role, or survey role. And all of these examples could end up in the scope of Awaabs law due to the associated defects that could occur, which is why the retrofit assessment and subsequent PIBI is absolutely crucial to identify defects that may prevent a measure being installed correctly. Following the PAS 2035 principles sets out a methodology to minimise these risks. And I've referenced already the procedure for the notification of hazards and that obligation to report hazards to the landlord, which may or may not be relevant to the retrofit works. In some cases, the defects actually materialise after the retrofit installation, with the cause often being poor detailing and or poor workmanship, with missed opportunities at various stages of the PAS process. The photos on screen are a live example of this, where we were acting in the role as an auditor. This property had significant penetrating damp associated with the lack of an extended eaves detail in association with the installation of an EWI system. This is a perfect example of where the installer hasn't followed the PAS standard or standard recognised details provided by the EWI manufacturer. This damp issue would absolutely fall under the scope of Awaabs law. Here is another example on the screen where retrofit hasn't had the desired outcome, and in fact a widespread issue. It was such a widespread issue that it was bad press for retrofit and lost public confidence in retrofit at the time. This case study is the EWI scheme in Fishwick, Preston, which is publicly available should anyone wish to read up further. And the scheme involved the installation of EWI to solid wall properties, which subsequently failed and led to significant damp-related defects. It is cited in some reports that have been produced that the failed EWI was as a result of poor detailing and poor workmanship. Again, this would be in scope of Awaabs law. Examples like this in the public domain give retrofit a bad name, and I think we all have a part to play in learning from this and preventing its reoccurrence. Let's look at some common issues. So with all of these examples comes considerable learning for the betterment of future retrofit projects. And we've collated our thoughts on the most commonly occurring issues to look out for at both pre and post retrofit. So things to look out for at pre-retrofit, which would need to be addressed prior to installing building fabric meshes, include bridged damp-proof courses, incorrect mortar repairs, cracked masonry or pointing, living space extended into uninhabitable part, cavity debris and or mortar snots, and subfloor air vents blocked. Now that's just a small selection of a wide range of things that you might pick up. And again, we've done the same, but this time for post-retrofit. And the quality aspects to look out for include whether the starter track positioning has been correctly installed, the presence of DMEVs with trickle vents, upstands to flat or pitched roofs, sill overhangs being insufficient, roof lines not extended, again subfloor air vents blocked by EWI, fans installed against ceiling and or wall junctions, and scathing details overlooked. All of these examples have the propensity to cause damp, mould and condensation issues, which places significant responsibility on anyone working in the retrofit arena to have an awareness of Awaabs law and understand the potential impact of sub-quality installations. The whole purpose of retrofit is to create warmer, more comfortable homes and ensure this is done without creating hazards that could fall into the scope of Awaabs law. Thanks very much for listening. I think if we now hand back to our host and potentially look at some questions that have been posed in the chat.
Thanks very much for the presentation.